Good afternoon and welcome to the ABNY-YP Policy Brief on Political Parties in New York City, featuring journalist Ross Barkan and moderated by Mariana Alexander, member of the Young Professional Steering Committee. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you so much to Ross for taking the time out of your busy day. You can submit your questions throughout the presentation via the Q&A function on the side, and we'll make sure to address them at the end. Please remember to promote and share the ABNY message via social media at A Better NY. I will now pass the screen to our YP host, Mariana, to introduce Ross and kick us off. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sarah. So hi, everyone. My name is Mariana Alexander. I'm on the steering committee for about 2 years now. And what I've loved so much about being a part of the network is that it provides so many opportunities to learn about the city and how it works. So I was excited when Sarah and Laura approached me about doing an event on something I know a little bit about. I'm certainly not an expert, and that is political parties here in New York City. And so outside of ABNY, I'm the president of a reform political club in Brooklyn called the New Kings Democrats. So that's kind of the perspective I'm bringing to this topic. But I'm very excited to talk today with Ross Barkan, who is a writer and journalist from New York City. He is a Guardian columnist and contributor to The Nation and Gothamist. His journalism and essays have appeared in The Times, The Washington Post, GQ, New York Magazine, and the Columbia Journalism Review. He is the author of a novel, Demolition Night, and teaches journalism and media studies at NYU and St. Joseph's College in Brooklyn. In 2018, he ran unsuccessfully for the state senate in his native Brooklyn. So Ross and I are both native Brooklynites, so we'll have to make a conscious effort to talk about the other boroughs as well. I would also add to his bio that he writes a deeply informative and thoughtful newsletter called Political Currents, which I believe is a fairly new product. But I would definitely recommend subscribing to it. It provides, what I like about it is it provides a lot of historical context to the stuff that we're seeing currently go on in politics, and that's not necessarily the context you get when you read the news on a day-to-day basis. So hopefully that suffices as an introduction, but I guess the first question I kind of wanted to ask, just to make sure everyone is super clear about what we say when we say political parties in New York City, can you flesh out for us what those organizations and entities actually are when we say party in New York City?
Sure. So the party infrastructure dates back, many decades, to the early 20th century, maybe before, where you had so when people talk about political parties, in New York City, the Democratic Party is obviously the dominant party. There is no other party that's remotely comparable to the Democratic Party. And so there's a formal structure to the Democratic Party, as there is to the Republican Party as well, and to third parties. But I'll just start with the Democratic Party. So, as is true in counties across America, each county has a Democratic Party organization. So in New York City, obviously 5 counties, 5 individual Democratic Party organizations: Kings County Democratic Party, Queens County, Bronx County, and so on. And these parties each have a county leader, a chair, the person who's the leader of the party. The leader of the party is elected by these unpaid elected officials called district leaders, and each borough has a different number of district leaders, and this is where it gets a bit in the weeds. But typically what is done is each state assembly district has a certain number of district leaders who are elected every 2 years. And these district leaders together vote on the chair of what they call, you'll see the county committee, and that's sort of synonymous with the Democratic Party. And so they're the district leaders. There's also the state committee, who are also elected locally throughout the state. You can be a state committee person, and that means you are a voting member of the statewide Democratic Party, and you have some say in the rules of the party and the functions of the party. And the rules vary by borough. So for example, in Brooklyn, if you're a district leader, you're automatically a state committee person. This is not true as far as I understand in other boroughs. But all of this dates back many, many decades to when district leaders, state committee people held much more power than they do today. There's a question we'll probably get to in a moment about a tree grows in Brooklyn that the district leader knocks on the door. So I can get to that in a moment. But suffice it to say, each county has a Democratic Party. Then there's the state Democratic Party, the New York State Democratic Party. That is effectively controlled by the governor, Andrew Cuomo. So he is deciding who chairs the party, usually to ally of the governor. Locally, the county committees that decide the chair have more autonomy to kind of pick who they want to be chair. So in theory, you know, the parties exist to elect more Democrats to office, to recruit volunteers, to raise money and help further the cause of Democrats in New York City. Does that always happen? No, and we can get into that as well. And the Republican Party, in a much more diminished form, functions in a similar way. We also obviously have third parties in the state, like the Green Party, the Working Families Party. I'm happy to talk more about WFP too. I know there may be questions about that, but you know, they also have their own individual structures. The Working Families Party does not function quite like a normal political party in that they are mostly concerned with running candidates on the Democratic line. You can run on the Working Families Party line as well. New York is very strange in terms of you are allowed to run on multiple party lines at once. This is not true in, you know, 30 something out of 50, I think 30, whatever it is, 35 states, whatever, you can't do it, maybe more, maybe even 40. I'd have to get the exact number. But in New York, for example, you can run as a Democrat, you can run as a Republican at the same time, and you can run as a member of the Working Families Party too. But WFP's function since 1998 has been to elect more progressive Democrats. So there are registered members of the Working Families Party. There aren't many of them. And they encourage most people who support WFP to register as Democrats. So they are very concerned, though they have a formal political party with a formal ballot line, they do not function in the same way we would think of kind of third parties. You know, when you think of like the Green Party, the old Socialist Party going back to the early 20th century, WFP is not interested in running candidates on their own line against Democrats. They want to run Democrats on their line and elect Democrats they feel are more in line with their values. DSA functions in a similar way, though DSA is not a formal political party. They do not have the ballot line status in New York. But happy to talk way more on that. That's just kind of very basic introduction to kind of the structure of the parties in the city and the state.
Yeah, so I think we'll talk about third parties a little later, but I want to talk a little bit about the history. So just to kind of reflect some things you said, each county has its own party, and the kind of entity is this committee, this county committee. And so I'm actually on the county committee in Brooklyn. I represent like 3 blocks with 3 other people. So there's about, I think, 5,000 seats on the Brooklyn County Committee. It's huge. And then above that, you have these district leaders that form the executive committee. And then on top of that, they elect the party boss or the party chair and all of that. So that, I mean, it's kind of an amazing infrastructure that right now is pretty dead in that a lot of these seats are completely empty. I think half of the seats in Brooklyn are empty. I can't speak to the other boroughs. So can you talk a little bit about why that structure was originally put in place? That such intensive manpower structure was put in place.
Sure. And
kind of like the heyday of parties a little bit.
Sure. So you'll hear the term a lot, the Democratic machine. It's a term that's still used, but there is no real Democratic machine in New York City. The party infrastructures themselves, as Mariana said, are very dormant and do not function the way they once did. So to go back in time, really the birth of the Democratic Party in New York City, you have to go back to the 19th century and Tammany Hall. Some of you may have heard of Tammany Hall. That was the Manhattan Democratic Party, or the New York County Democratic Committee. And Tammany Hall really was the first very powerful Democratic organization, not just in New York, but really in the country. And they derived their strength from Irish immigrants. So Tammany Hall's politics, were not necessarily progressive. It would kind of depend on the moment they were in. At times they were against kind of the more progressive elements in the country. Times they're very much opposed. So the Democratic Party of that era, will start kind of the 19th century, was very focused on getting jobs for people in city government, also known as patronage. Certainly stealing money was a part of it too, or misappropriating maybe, but also providing services for neighborhoods as well. This was an era in the 19th century when you did not have the same sort of public social services that you had today. There's no such thing, obviously, as Social Security. There's no such thing as unemployment insurance. There was no such thing as welfare. So all of these kind of government functions were actually being taken up by the Democratic Party in New York City in the 19th and early 20th century. So the party boss would be providing turkeys on Thanksgiving. The district leaders would be going around, getting to know everyone in the neighborhood. If you were involved with the Democratic Party, you could get a job in city government. The patronage was very direct. Tammany Hall, which would try to elect, usually successfully, state senators, mayors, governors, and in turn, these Democratic, party electeds would then provide jobs for those that they knew. So if you were friends with the party, you could get a patronage job in city government. If you're not, you were frozen out. Very problematic system. But the upside of the system was it actually bred engagement with local politics, because there was a reason to, there was a very direct reason to care about who your district leader was, who your state senator was, who your alderman was for the city council. It was because these people were the ones very directly providing services to you and your family. And if you were a good Democratic Party soldier, you could get a job. And so you had the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was also quite strong in New York in the 19th, through for a long time in the 20th century. The interesting thing about the Republican Party is it's very much evolved ideologically and politically. If you go back to the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Republican Party was a liberal, reformist, anti-machine party. When LaGuardia ran for mayor in the 30s, he ran against the Democratic machine as a reform Republican with a very, what we describe as like a liberal progressive agenda. So, the Republican Party had, like Democratic Party, many different factions and kind of competing parts to it. But for a long time, it existed as a very robust reform-oriented party. And then just as within the Democratic Party in the 20th century, you had very conservative factions, you had very liberal factions. New York obviously is in the north, so Democrats there tended to be more liberal, but not always. The Republican Party had a very liberal faction, and we had fairly moderate to liberal Republican governors like Thomas Dewey, who ran for president, was supposed to win and lost to Harry Truman. He's the governor of New York. He was not what you'd think of as like a modern day Republican, but he represented kind of what the Republican Party of that era was. And they were all, and since the parties, it's important just to think about political parties back then. They were a lot stronger in terms of that. They were very directly involved in electing candidates to office and funding them, and then providing jobs for their supporters. But they were very ideologically fluid. So there would be these weird situations where in the 1940s, you could have there was a congressional race in Brooklyn where the socialists and sort of the left-wing factions were supporting the same candidate as Thomas Dewey and like the upstate Republicans, because they were both aligned against the Democratic Party. And New York also has a very rich tradition of third parties too. So you had the Socialist Party in the early 20th century, which for a time was electing successfully on third party lines, city council members and state legislators. You had the American Labor Party, which came after that, which was sort of a precursor to the Working Families Party, kind of like a pro-labor progressive party. After the American Labor Party, we had the Liberal Party, which started as kind of a progressive left-wing party, but then evolved sort of away from its roots as time went on. So, you went from having kind of very ideologically fluid parties as there's polarization in the 20th century that started to change. And also, you had also the diminishing power of parties as time went on. And, really after the 1970s, I would say, the reform movement, like New King's Democrats and others, really kind of broke in certain boroughs the power of parties. And today we're seeing really the profound weakening of these political party power structures, the Democratic Party in particular, in New York City. That brief history, I can go further, but that's some of it right there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to respond to a few things. Like, one, I think you've hit upon what I think is so incredible about these dormant structures is that it does have the potential for real, like, neighbor to neighbor organizing that, I think would be transformative. And that's part of the reason why New King's Democrats does the work it does. But so you talked a little bit about this, how kind of patronage and the ability to pad contracts was really the kind of grease to the machine that kept these political parties going, and incentivized them to really control what was happening in terms of who got elected. So, to some extent, I think it was reforms to civil service, to procurement reform.
Yes, civil service reform was very big, yes.
Yeah, chip away at that. And I guess I'm curious what you think about the charter revision of 1989, when the city dismantled the Board of Estimate and moved to its current form of government, because did that not take a lot of power away from the county parties?
Yeah, so that's a great point. So for those who don't know, New York City government functions very differently post 1989 than did pre 1989. So the board for most of the 20th century, there was something called the Board of Estimate that really governed New York City. It was made up of votes from the mayor, the city controller. Each borough president had a vote on the Board of Estimate. So this made each borough president inordinately powerful. You had a city council, but the city council didn't really have much role in it. I believe the city council president got a vote on the Board of Estimate, and this Board of Estimate was setting the budget. It was making land use decisions. It was a very powerful entity, and it empowered the individual county leaders and borough presidents a lot. So if you were the Democratic chair in Queens, you maybe helped elect the borough president. In some cases, the borough president was the chair, like Donald Maness, the powerful Queens borough president. He was also chair of the Queens Democratic Party. So you had a vote on this Board of Estimate. This made you very, very powerful. You were helping to set a citywide agenda. So basically what happened was there's a Supreme Court case that ruled it unconstitutional, in part because it wasn't fairly representing by population, so it wasn't proportional. So Staten Island, for example, had the same representation as Brooklyn on the Board of Estimate. Brooklyn is many times larger than Staten Island. So the Board of Estimate was dissolved. We got the modern system we have now, which is the 51-member city council with the mayor. The Board of Estimate was gone, and the borough presidents were rendered much weaker than they were before. And you had a new position created called public advocate, which was sort of a continuation of the city council president. So yes, the Board of Estimate era definitely empowered the outer borough counties, especially in Brooklyn and Queens. You think about, I didn't really touch on kind of the end of the powerful party era. I would say after the 1970s, you saw a real decline, in part driven by the Board of Estimate. Ed Koch as mayor was very close to the county leaders in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. If you read the history of Donald Trump in the 70s, Donald Trump got his start because his father was very closely aligned with the Brooklyn Democratic leader, the Bronx Democratic leader. When Donald Trump got his big tax abatement through the Commodore Hotel in the 1970s, he got that because the deputy mayor under Koch, it was Stanley Friedman, and he was a law partner of Roy Cohn's. If you know Roy Cohn, he was the horrible lawyer who kind of was Donald Trump's mentor. So, these county leaders were setting the agenda for the city. And after it Koch, you saw a beginning of decline in that. I think the Board of Estimate played a role. I think just civil service reform definitely played a role. Each decade, it's just gotten harder and harder which is a good thing for county leaders to put their friends in government jobs. And if you are a county leader, if you are not offering jobs to people, if you don't have kind of any pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, why should the regular busy person who's got a lot on their plate care about Democratic Party politics, right? So if they're not ideologically motivated and they're not getting a job out of the county leader, they disengage. So I think definitely a lot of those factors played a role. And I would argue that after the end of the Board of Estimate era, the 1990s and 2000s, even though the parties were diminishing a lot, they were kind of able to coast on reputation. So think of Joe Crowley never getting an opponent when he was the Queens County leader, possible successor of Nancy Pelosi. He'd been in Congress, about 20 years, never had a viable opponent, in part because people said, well, he's the county leader, he's very scary. Even though the county leaders weren't what they used to be, well, Joe Crowley's a big deal, right? So they were able to kind of subsist, I would say, on this, and this, I don't know if inertia is the right word, but kind of this built-in deference. And it was kind of like a house built on sand, because the county leaders today don't have these very active political clubs with volunteers, right? You have clubs that are active and do things, but they aren't necessarily aligned with the party bosses anymore. So someone like Joe Crowley, along comes a charismatic 28-year-old who says, I'm going to run against Joe Crowley, and she wins rather big. And obviously AOC ran quite a good race, but it was also an indictment of kind of Joe Crowley's weaknesses as well. And you're seeing this now all the time. Elliot Engel was just defeated this June. Incumbents are being knocked off at a rate you haven't seen in a while. And I do believe some of this was a long time in coming and probably could have happened earlier in history if kind of there had been a growing awareness of how you could organize against incumbents. Also, I would argue too, but the internet was also a big change. So let me add that too. The ability to fundraise online was a dramatic shift, where if you were a reform or a left-wing candidate or a political outsider, you could not raise $100,000 or $200,000 to run against your incumbent state senator or Congress member. There was no way. With the internet, suddenly you can outraise the incumbent. And that's been a dramatic shift. And that's really the last few years with Act Blue, with the rise of small donor giving with Bernie Sanders. That's been also a very dramatic shift. It's been a game changer.
Yeah, for sure. Just on the historical note, I have to always plug a book called City for Sale, which is just
I read City for Sale. Yeah,
a great rundown of how wild things were in the 80s and before. It's a great read. So the parties are definitely playing a greatly diminished role in New York City politics. They continue to exist because actually they have to exist. I just learned this, but they have to exist if there are going to be any Democrats in Brooklyn. So if the Brooklyn Democratic Party didn't form, no one would be able to run as a Democrat in Brooklyn. So there is this kind of like built-in necessity to have them just as like a fact of state law. But then I think there are like three areas where they continue to hold power and influence. And some of it is hard, some of it is soft, and sometimes hard to understand why they have this soft power because there's no hard power to back it up. But the way I see it, there's three areas. There's the Board of Elections, there's who gets to be the city council speaker, and then lastly, there's judges. So I think if we just can go through those three things, sure. Do you want to talk a little bit about the BOE and how wild it is?
Yeah. So the Board of, if you want to see what old school Democratic Party and Republican Party patronage looked like, look at the Board of Elections in New York City and throughout the state. The Board of Elections, the body overseeing our democracy is the last bastion of patronage in New York, and it's quite remarkable. The mayor of New York actually has very little power over the Board of Elections. The law is all set by the state, and the whole structure, the employees of the Board of Elections are allies and appointees of the local Democratic parties and the Republican parties as well. And this is a structure that goes back decades, if not a century, and it's been with us. There's been no reform of the BOE, literally none, despite disaster after disaster. And I argue personally that starts with the governor and the state legislature, because you have to change the state law. Ideally, we have a nonpartisan government agency overseeing elections, but we don't. We have a bipartisan, Democratic and Republican parties together are overseeing the elections in New York, and this is not in the spirit of civil service reform, in that you don't have a bureaucratic process in which you have applicants applying and the best ones are hired. It's a political process. Poll workers too, the people who work the polls, they usually are allies of the local Democratic Party. Maybe they're friends of the district leader. It's one of those last perks the district leader has, making your friend a poll worker. So the BOE is still a big nest of patronage, and it's a problem, and it won't change until the governor and the state legislature take action. That's the truth. I'll touch on the one area where the party is probably losing some of their influence, which is the city council speaker. You're going to have, so traditionally, the political parties, as recently as 2017, with the election of Corey Johnson, were playing a very direct role in who became the city council speaker, because in part, the Queens and Bronx Democratic parties were always able to organize their council members in blocks, and they would block vote together, and then they could effectively pick a council speaker if they have a block of 20 something votes, whatever it was. And this was always one of the areas where the outer borough Democratic machine, so to speak, could have influence. So what do you get when you pick a county speaker? You get patronage. The city council is still, in the central staff in particular, filled with patronage. You still have staffers who are there who have jobs because of Joe Crowley, well-paying jobs, six-figure jobs, because of Joe Crowley's influence and his predecessors as well. I would argue that's going to change in 2021, because you're going to have so many vacancies. You're going to have about 38 open seats out of 51, huge number. Many of these candidates will be running as progressive reformer outsiders. And because Joe Crowley was defeated, and the Queens party is just ever diminished, and the Bronx party too is ever diminished, with Elliot Engel being defeated and Jeff Klein being defeated by Alessandra Biaggi, I don't think these parties will be able to force the new members to block a vote like they used to. And so you may see a very different, very wide open process. That's to be determined. That's just my guess. And in the one area where, yes, the parties do a great amount of influence is the legal system, the judicial system in New York. And that is very key. And that gets kind of to the heart of this. Well, why should you care about who your Democratic Party is? And you should care because they elect judges. That's why you should care. So it's a bit complicated. Criminal court judges and family court judges in New York are appointed. There is a mayoral appointment system. So they go through a screening panel, and their names are recommended. And so it's done in kind of a more professionalized, bureaucratic way. Civil court judges and state Supreme Court judges are elected. So civil court judges run in Democratic primaries, and inevitably these primaries are not contested. Inevitably the turnout is very low, and inevitably the Democratic Party supported judge wins. And if you look at who are the civil court judges in New York City and in the state, many of them are allies, sometimes family members of elected officials, allies of elected officials. you look at the state Supreme Court judges, which is the higher level, and state Supreme Court is not the highest level in New York State. It's actually the Court of Appeals, but state Supreme is a level up from the civil. They don't even have contested primaries. That's actually the district leaders and judicial delegates in a sort of choreographed process pick the state Supreme Court judges. And since there are no primary,
just because that's such a weird thing, let's really explain the Judicial Convention. So like you said, civil court is kind of run like a normal election. You run in a primary and you run in a general election. But for the convention, or for Supreme Court judges, right, we elect instead delegates to a convention.
Delegates. So you have elected judicial delegates, and for the first time in my memory, there were actually competitive judicial delegate races this past June. So some new people were elected judicial delegates, but typically these judicial delegates at a quote unquote convention choose the Democratic nominee for state Supreme Court. Now, as you talked about, this process is quite dormant in many ways, and so what that means is the county leader, the Democratic Party boss, is telling the delegates and the district leader, the district leaders usually play a role in judicial selection as well, since they're kind of a level up from the delegates. They're in essence, they tell them, okay, you're gonna support my friend Mariana for state Supreme Court judge, and they go, cool, yeah, we will.
But it's even worse than that, isn't it? Because at the conventions, they say you only have one choice. All you have to do is rubber stamp that person we're putting in front of you.
I've attended a convention. There's sort of like Soviet elections, and that there is no contest. There are no competing candidates. There's a slate presented, and the delegates rubber stamp the slate. The conventions, I think in Queens, they're usually once a year. And they are not democratic at all, a small d democratic. And that's how state Supreme Court judges are picked. And remember, state Supreme Court judges have 14-year terms. They can serve longer than civil court judges. So most, if not all, the state Supreme Court judges in New York owe their positions because they were closely aligned with their local Democratic Party. So typically, like when I went to Judicial Convention last year in Queens, and I was going down the list and kind of looking at who are these people who are being nominated, and inevitably they are members of local Democratic clubs. They are lawyers who maybe worked for an elected official at some point. They are all kind of party people in good standing. So the people who get elected to the state Supreme Court and to the civil court in New York are not there because necessarily their judicial prudence or kind of their abilities. They're there because they greased the right wheels and they made the right contacts out of law school in a very kind of direct way that transcends what we even think of as networking. You must be a party soldier and a fairly regular donor to the Democratic Party, to their causes, to then become a civil court or state Supreme Court judge in New York City. That is a fact. If we have any lawyers here on the Zoom who want to be civil court judges or state Supreme Court judges, join your local Democratic club and become friends with those people, and hope in time your name is called. And that's been the process for many decades now. And the only change from now and then is the Republican Party used to have kind of a seat at the table in this patronage process. They don't anymore. So back when the Republicans had a lot of power in the state, they had governors. Usually in the boroughs, they kind of split it up. They would kind of, all right, these judges, you get some Republican judges, some Democratic judges. Now the Democrats run it. So that is how the judges are determined. And I should just touch on Surrogates Court quickly. If you die without a will in New York City or New York State, you enter your will ends up in Surrogates Court, and it gets cut up by basically Democratic Party patronage lawyers who then will take a cut of your estate. Long story short, and in Brooklyn and Queens especially, the Democratic parties have played a very direct role in controlling Surrogates Court. that is still the case. That has not changed even with the defeat of Joe Crowley. The party-controlled lawyers are still enriching themselves in surrogates court, and you do not get appointed as a guardian in surrogates court, and you do not get to be, a counsel to the administrator's office. All these things, you do not get any of those things without being very closely aligned with the Democratic Party. So the judicial system absolutely is the place parties probably exert the most influence.
For sure. And one thing to note is that, yes, the civil process is fairly open in that, anyone who is a lawyer and I think meets certain qualifications could run. There's nothing preventing them from running. But if you ever wanted to become a Supreme Court judge, which I think most people do, right? Because you get to serve till you're, 4 years longer, you have a higher salary. Then if you ran for civil without the backing of your party organization, you could be assured that they would never put you through and up into Supreme Court. So there's this kind of, we have one question from the audience from Adrian, who asks, judges will say that their convoluted selection system actually keeps them more accountable to the grassroots. In your view, are there upsides to our arcane system?
No, because the system, it's kind of a worst of all world system. It's not a pure appointment system where we think of Supreme Court, federal court judges getting appointed, right? And I personally am much more sympathetic to the appointment system. But if you want to argue that no, the appointment system makes a judge unaccountable to the masses, to the voters, and we want an election, New York isn't providing a pure election system either. As we just talked about with the state Supreme Court, there is no Democratic Party for state Supreme Court. There is for civil, but not state Supreme. So you have a system that is not even a actual open Democratic primary system for picking a judge. You have this strange amalgamation of an appointment system and of an elected system. So instead you get a weird mix of patronage and party lawyers running in pretend elections to then become judges. So I think either you need to go to a nonpartisan appointment-based system. Not the federal judges are not nonpartisan, obviously, and the presidents appoint them. But the New York system is particularly antiquated and strange, and it is failing on two fronts. On both, if you want to have a democratic system and elect judges, you're not really doing that. And if you want an appointed system free of maybe the politics, so to speak, you're not really getting that entirely either. So it's not a good system. And from what I understand, it's not replicated in most other states. It's kind of a relic of a different era.
Yeah, and this system was actually challenged in the Supreme Court of the United States by a candidate named Margarita Lopez Torres, who is currently one of Brooklyn's surrogate court judges. And I think forget the exact quote, but in the decision, what they said, it is unfortunately constitution because stupid laws aren't inherently unconstitutional, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that was Stevens. Yeah, who that was his. Yeah. No, it was a court case that actually was pretty successful on the local level. But yeah, the Supreme Court unfortunately ruled it constitutional on those grounds that while you can go back and look at that Supreme Court decision from the 2000s, and the Supreme Court very openly says New York has an awful system for picking judges, and really it's nonsensical in many ways, but it's constitutional. States can make their own laws and govern themselves in bizarre, silly ways. That was in essence their opinion. So what you really need from reform is the state legislature and the governor to change the law and really overhaul how judges are picked. We have a very Byzantine court system in New York State. It can be consolidated. We have many, many different departments. Not true in other states, so if you if you have to deal with the court system, you may have to go to family court and then go to civil court and then go to another facet of the court system, and it can be really quite a maze for a lot of people, and it's a very unwieldy system that should be consolidated.
Yeah. So those are I think the three areas. The other, where the parties still have power, the other place where I forgot that they have substantial power, hard power, is that if for some reason the Democratic candidate, resigns or ends up not actually running, it's right that it's the party that picks who gets to ultimately run.
So you're talking for normal, for like normal elections, right?
Yes, for normal elections.
Yeah. So the other area where the parties still have power is if a state lawmaker resigns or dies, it is the local Democratic Party that is picking the nominee in a special election, if it's called by the governor, to replace that elected official. I say state because if you are a city council member, you are under city law, and the city law is much better in this regard. The mayor automatically calls a nonpartisan special election to take place. And so you don't have this situation. If you're a city council member and you resign, the replacement city council member is picked through a open special election, technically nonpartisan. You run under own party lines, and it's democratic, and a winner wins by getting the most votes. Now, if you're a state senator and assembly member, you are under state law, not city law. So then if the person resigns or dies, there's a vacancy. The governor doesn't have to call a special election. It's by governor's discretion. There were times Cuomo would left seats vacant for a year or more, and just till the next primary election cycle. Other times, most of the time, a special election is called. When that is called, the Democratic Party nominates a candidate. So unless the district is a swing district or there are Republicans, the Democratic Party nominee is going to be the winner. There are rare exceptions. There have been special elections where the Working Families Party backed candidate has defeated the Democratic Party backed candidate in a special election. It's happened a few times. It wasn't a special election, but Tish James won on the Working Families Party line in 2003 when she was elected to the council. She beat a Democrat. And Diana Richardson, a state assemblywoman, she was in a special, that was a special election, and she won on the WFP line. There actually was no, for weird reasons, there's no Democratic Party candidate in that race. So typically, the Democratic Party nominates someone in a state race, and that's it. They become the new state lawmaker there.
And I don't know how accurate this is because I've never actually dug into it, but I've heard that about a third of state legislators in Albany were chosen through special election. Does that seem right?
It's a pretty big number. Yeah, it's a shockingly big number. And, because for a long time, the Democratic Party organizations, exerted a lot of influence, and they really wanted to pick the replacements for state lawmakers. So they would, perhaps if the state senator, the assembly member, wanted to leave or retire, they would do it in such a way where there would not be an open primary to replace them. The party would get to pick. So yes, there's a very big number. Joe Crowley infamously became a congressman because the predecessor congressman, who was also chair of the Queens Democratic Party, actually resigned after petitions were submitted. So he was running for re-election on the Democratic Party line. He submits his petitions. Then he says, I'm not going to run for re-election anymore. So this triggers a process where the vacancy must be filled immediately. And so the congressman was named Tom Manton. There's an assemblyman named Joe Crowley he was very fond of and sort of thought of as his protege, which he was. And Joe Crowley was picked to fill this vacancy on the petitions. And Joe Crowley became the Democratic nominee for the congressional seat and never ran in any sort of primary. So Yes, a lot of elections happen this way. The frequency is diminishing for sure. You're seeing it happen less and less. And that will probably continue, but you still have a lot of state lawmakers that arrive through this very anti-democratic process.
Yeah. In the last cycle in Brooklyn, it happened in at least 3 races, but mostly at the district leader level. So not at this,
Yeah.
So we have a question from the gang. Do you think the Republican Party will be able to push viable mayoral candidates in the future? Or do you foresee mayors being decided effectively in the party primary with little contest in the general? And, is this because of the Republican Party's association with the president?
I think that if for the foreseeable future, the Democratic primary for mayor will determine who the next mayor is going to be. The Republican Party is very much diminished in New York City. Enrollment is far, far below that of the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party now has an 8-to-1 enrollment advantage. That's enormous. Donald Trump certainly has made the brand more toxic, but even before Donald Trump, you look at the 2013 mayoral race, Bill de Blasio absolutely crushed Joe Lhota. He got over 70% of the vote, I believe. So that was pre-Donald Trump, and Joe Lhota was something, of a acceptable moderate Republican, and he was completely annihilated. I think the only way the Republican Party wins a mayor's race is if they run someone who spends Michael Bloomberg level money or something beyond that to win. That is the only way I see a Republican Party mayoral candidate being viable against a Democrat. It is with a enormous spending advantage. Don't forget, Michael Bloomberg spent as much as $100 million to win a mayoral race, which is an absurd number. Just putting it into context, Donald Trump didn't even spend that much of his own money to win the 2016 race. He raised more and spent more, but his own personal funds were under $100 million. So if there's another Michael Bloomberg, if there's someone of that level of wealth and who maybe commands sort of this broad level of respect among Democrats, some Democrats, I should say, there's a possibility. I would not rule it out, but absent someone of extraordinary wealth, a Republican can't be competitive against a Democrat in a New York City mayoral election. And
wealth might be a liability given current antipathy towards billionaires. So there's another question about the future, which is an open-ended question. Where do you see the city going in the next 5 to 10 years, given the financial crisis, a new administration, numerous new city council members coming into positions of power in the coming years?
Fascinating question that no one has a great answer to, because COVID has cast such a cloud over it. So I actually did a piece this week for Gothamists and WNYC on the current budget crisis in the city. We are in a very dark place financially. Doesn't mean we'll be in that place a few years from now, especially if there's a major federal bailout within the next year, or funds are produced through tax hikes or through borrowing. But certainly in the moment, the city is in a very difficult place, the most difficult place it's been since the 1970s fiscal crisis. You will probably see some pretty significant political tensions arising from that, because the next city council class will definitely be more left than the current one. You're going to see not necessarily a lot of DSA members winning, because they themselves don't know how many candidates they want to support, but what you will see is many candidates who are what I would call DSA adjacent, or who kind of speak a similar language and advocate for similar values, winning elections. So even, you saw in this past June, the legislative primaries, I'm sure Mariana is very well acquainted to Emily Gallagher, for example. She was not endorsed by DSA, but I would call her DSA adjacent, in that she shares many of the same policy positions. And so you're going to see a lot of candidates like that. They don't win with DSA support. They're still going to be speaking kind of the same language and pursuing similar priorities. So inevitably, you're going to get a more left city council. The mayor is very much an open question. I don't have any real predictions on that because it's a wide open race and there's no obvious front runner, even more so than 2013, I would say. And so I think you'll have tensions because barring a major federal bailout or barring the raising of taxes or the borrowing of a lot of money that can fill the shortfalls, you're going to see some version of austerity, and you're going to see a real tension and pushback from a very left city council and from a mayor who probably won't be quite as left as the council. That's usually how it ends up playing out with the mayor and the legislature. So that will be a tension. Again, the open question is how much money can New York recuperate if there's a vaccine and really life returns to normal next year, if economic activity resumes, and how big could a federal bailout be, especially if Donald Trump is defeated and you get a Biden administration to bail out New York City. That is a big open question because as of right now, if there is no federal money and there is no attempt to raise taxes or borrow money, you are looking at a gaping hole in a major reduction in city services. Yesterday, the MTA was talking about essentially cutting services in half, which seems like more of a threat than a reality because they're talking about things that seem unthinkable, like adding 15 minutes of wait time to the subway, or like cutting Long Island Railroad service, to once every 60 minutes. Very extreme, will probably not happen, but this is what's kind of on the table if other revenue streams do not arrive. So it is my hope that in some form, whether through bailout money, through tax increases, through borrowing, some of these shortfalls are filled. If they are not filled, you will see an extreme and very self-defeating contraction of city services. You will see higher unemployment, and you will see a shrinking of government, which for some people may be an outcome they want, but I warn you, even for fiscal hawks out there, when you say shrinking government, you mean you're adding to the unemployment rolls in New York State. That's in essence what you mean. So not a great situation either. And you also see a diminishment of demand and spending power. So we're very much at a crossroads. It's going to depend on what happens, I'd say, in the next 6 months, maybe. The presidential election here will be very key. If you get a Democratic administration, you will get certainly a more New York City friendly administration.
So we're coming to time. So I guess I'll just ask one more question that we got from the attendees. Actually, I'll let you pick. Either answer, what was your biggest lesson learned from your recent run for Senate, or is DSA going to take over New York City politics?
I'll try to combine them to help everyone out. So the biggest lesson I would say was how much work goes into a political campaign. It's incredibly rewarding and incredibly exhausting, and unless you do it or you volunteer for a campaign or work for one, you don't understand the amount of time you dedicate to it. I was running 14-hour days, 15-hour days from sunup to sundown and beyond. It consumes your life. It consumes your personal life. This is if you're doing it correctly. I'd say correctly in terms of you are running to try to win. If you're not trying to win, trying to have fun, you'll have a very easy time of it. So it's incredibly time consuming and very, very rewarding, but it's very taxing. And that's something people should be aware of. Certainly in terms of the amount of people you meet, you go door knocking, knocked on many thousands of doors. The fundraising aspect is also very challenging too, in terms of calling people and asking them for money. It's certainly, if you're shy about that stuff, you got to overcome it very quickly if you want to raise money. And then I'll quickly do DSA. Yes and no. DSA is not terribly interested right now in running a large city council slate, but certainly their influence is growing dramatically, and they are going to have a say in the next city council one way or the other, and the issues they're advocating for will bleed over into the state legislature, into the city council. So they are probably one of the most important organizations and influential organizations now in New York City. because they command a very large volunteer base. They are doing some of the work the old Democratic parties did, which is the old Democratic parties had a lot of volunteers. Going back to Tree Groves in Brooklyn, the district leader knocking on the door of the neighbor. DSA is now knocking those doors. They are, in a way, filling the holes of the Democratic Party, which has abandoned grassroots politics in terms of getting out the vote, knocking on doors, organizing neighborhoods. DSA is taking and filling some of that role. They don't have the patronage to offer, but they are an organizing driven body. So will they take over completely? No. There's a lot of other interests that play. The real estate industry is still quite significant, and finance, and the labor unions are very strong too. But DSA absolutely is going to be more influential in the 2020s, and more candidates want that endorsement, will seek it, and by seeking it, they will seek to adopt the politics of DSA, and that's the way they can influence, not just through the candidates they helped elect. It's through candidates who share their values or want to share their values because maybe they're afraid of them, or they want their support in the future.
Right. Yeah, so we definitely have an interesting year or two of politics ahead of us, to say the least. Sorry I did not get to every question, but I think we covered a good range. So I will thank you very much, Ross, for agreeing to do this and sharing with us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and I'll hand it back over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Ross, for sharing your time and your wisdom and advice with the young professionals, and Mariana for being truly a rock star member of the YP Steering Committee and amazing moderator. This wraps up our YP policy brief on political parties, and thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.